By the time she was 9 years old, she had already sung for an entire nation hiding from bombs. By the time she was 30, she had a French husband, a fortune, and a home in 3 different countries. By the time she was 90, she had sold more records than almost any woman in British history, and she was still, somehow, packing a suitcase for the next tour. It looks, from the outside, like the ultimate fairy tale. A girl from a modest nursing family who became a global star, married for over 60 years to the same devoted man. Look closer, though, and the fairy tale gets complicated. The marriage was not quite what it appeared. The homes were never quite home. Even the money, in the end, could only buy so much. This is the story of what fame gave her, and what it quietly, patiently, took away. She was born Sally Clark in Epsom, Surrey, in 1932, the only child of 2 psychiatric nurses. Her mother was Welsh, with a soprano's voice and a habit of singing around the house. Her father had wanted, once, to go on the stage himself, but his own parents had talked him out of it, and so that dream sat quietly in him, waiting for somewhere else to land. It landed on his daughter. Young Sally had grown up with the sound of dogfights overhead and the routine scramble to the shelters, an ordinary wartime childhood on the surface. Then, in October 1942, an air raid siren cut through a BBC broadcast at a London theatre, and the children packed inside grew frightened. Someone called for a volunteer to sing and calm the room. 9-year-old Sally stepped up and sang "Mighty Lack a Rose." The reaction in the control room was strong enough that producers recorded her voice on the spot, and within weeks, she was on national radio. Soon after, her father gave her a new name for the stage. Stitched together, he liked to joke, from 2 old girlfriends called Pet and Ula. Petula hated it. She still does. But it stuck, and by the time she turned 10, Britain had already decided who she was. Its own answer to Shirley Temple, singing hope into air raid shelters and army camps alike. A child carrying a nation's morale on her small shoulders. By the end of the war, her father had stopped waiting in the wings. Leslie Clark became her manager, and in 1950 he went further, co-founding a record label, Polygon, built specifically around his daughter's voice. She was placed under contract to her own father's company before she was out of her teens. The work never let up. Records show over 500 concert appearances before she turned 12. Wartime tours for troops and civilians who adored her as a symbol of hope. Film offers followed just as quickly, nearly 24 of them by the time she reached her 20s. Each one reinforcing the image the public had already fixed in its mind. The eternal child star, forever singing songs of comfort, forever young. The trouble was, she wasn't young anymore. She was a grown woman by then, restless under a nickname she'd never chosen. Stitched together, her father liked to joke, from 2 old girlfriends called Pet and Ula, and a career shaped almost entirely by men who weren't her. Audiences still wanted the little girl from the radio, singing the same reassuring songs she'd been handed as a child. Her father still ran both her diary and her bank account, deciding which films she took, which songs she recorded, which rooms she walked into. Friends later said she grew visibly frustrated, caught somewhere between gratitude for the fame he'd built her and resentment at how tightly he still held the reins. It would take her the better part of a decade to finally step out from under his management. And even then, the parting, by her own account, would not be an easy one. "I didn't want to go to France," she said, years later, of the move that would remake her entire life. "When I'd been there on holiday, I thought it was beautiful, but a bit smelly. It was not the reaction of a woman chasing her destiny. It was the reaction of someone being pushed toward it against her will." Through the 1950s, the hits kept coming. The Little Shoemaker, With All My Heart, Suddenly There's a Valley, each one still released through Polygon, her father's label, still tethered to the deal he had built around her as a child. She was, by any outward measure, one of Britain's most successful young entertainers, a familiar face in cinemas and on the wireless alike. And still, the accounts show, she felt hampered, boxed in by an image the public refused to let her outgrow. Audiences wanted the cherub who had sung through the Blitz. They were far less interested in the woman she was quietly becoming underneath it. By 1957, something had to give. She and her father parted ways professionally, ending his role as her manager after more than a decade of running her career. That situation had to end, she later admitted. it had become difficult. It was not a clean, celebratory break. It was the quiet, awkward severing of a bond that had made her famous and controlled her in equal measure, the sort of ending that leaves both people wounded, and neither one entirely sure who did the wounding. Her record company had other plans for her regardless. They believed her future lay across the channel, and pushed her toward Paris whether she wanted to go or not. She went, reluctantly, carrying little more than a suitcase and a record contract, without a manager of her own, without her father steering the ship for the first time in her adult life, and without the faintest idea that an unremarkable booking at a French concert hall was about to hand her the one relationship that would define the rest of her story. Paris, 1958. She was booked for an unexpected headline show at the Olympia, the grandest music hall in France, an engagement she'd taken almost by accident, still reeling from the split with her father, and unsure what came next. Somewhere in the whirl of rehearsals and record executives, she met a young French producer named Claude Wolff. It was, by every account that survives, an easy, natural connection. Two people who understood the same industry from the inside. Speaking a shorthand, neither had to explain to the other. What began as a professional introduction did not stay professional for long. Within a few years, Claude was not just courting her, he was managing her, taking over the very role her father had once held. The business and the romance folding into one another almost from the start. Contracts and courtship signed in the same breath. On June 8, 1961, Petula Clark became Petula Wolff, in a ceremony that made headlines on both sides of the channel. The marriage would last, in one form or another, for more than 60 years. France, for its part, fell for her completely. Freed from the deal that had bound her to Polygon, singing now in a language she'd had to learn from scratch, she became the country's most popular female vocalist almost overnight, a reinvention as total as anyone in the business could have hoped for. On paper, it read like the perfect second act. A fresh country, a fresh sound, a devoted husband who understood her work as well as her heart. It looked, from every angle the public was allowed to see, like she had finally found her footing, and someone steady to stand beside her while she found it. Whether that footing was as solid as it appeared would take years, and an ocean's worth of touring, and a great deal of quiet compromise to fully reveal. In 1965, she became the first British woman ever to top the American charts, and she did it with a song called Downtown, a Grammy winner that turned her, almost overnight, into a name recognized from Los Angeles to Tokyo. More hits followed in quick succession: I Know a Place, Don't Sleep in the Subway, My Love, Color My World, each one climbing the charts on both sides of the Atlantic, each one adding another few million records to a tally that would eventually reach an estimated 100 million sold worldwide. The company she kept read like a scrapbook of the era's biggest names. She sat across dinner tables from Frank Sinatra and once watched, astonished, as he pulled out a gun mid-meal, a story she would tell for decades afterward, half horrified, half delighted. She danced through fields with Fred Astaire during a film shoot, the two of them laughing between takes like old friends rather than strangers thrown together by a studio contract. She politely turned down an advance from Elvis Presley in Las Vegas, a moment she recalled with more amusement than drama. Presidents wanted to hear her sing. So did practically everyone else who mattered in an industry built almost entirely on wanting. The wealth that came with all of it was, by any measure, staggering. There was a Rolls-Royce for the everyday driving, an apartment in Geneva, a chalet in Megève, the Saint-Tropez of the winter, as she liked to call it, and a flat in Knightsbridge for whenever London called. Cooks, housekeepers, nannies, secretaries, a rotating cast of au pairs, all of it staffed by people she was quick to say she genuinely liked, and who, by her own account, genuinely liked her back. From the outside, it looked less like a career and more like a life lived entirely without limits. A woman who could touch down almost anywhere in the world and find a version of comfort already waiting for her. And yet, asked once where home actually was, she didn't have a simple answer. I feel at home in New York, in Paris, and in London, she said. But I laugh more when I am in England. 3 countries, 3 versions of belonging, gathered across a lifetime of departure lounges and touring schedules, and not quite a single place she could point to and call, without qualification, hers. Home, she once admitted, had become, now, a complex concept, a phrase that sounded almost like a joke, until you realized she meant every word of it. The fairy tale, as it turned out, had one detail the public wasn't told for decades. Claude and Petula stayed married, on paper, for the rest of his life, more than 60 years in total, right up until his death in March 2024, at the age of 93. But somewhere around 3 decades into that marriage, by her own later account, the romance itself simply came to an end. They kept the ring. They kept the surname. They did not, for the most part, keep the relationship. What they built instead was quieter and stranger than either divorce or devotion. Two people who had once loved each other, still fond of one another, still legally bound, now living largely separate lives, meeting for family occasions and photographs, maintaining, in public, the shape of the union they'd once had in private. She did not hide this forever. In 2016, sitting on a British daytime sofa, Petula told the nation, calmly and without apparent shame, that there was someone new in her life. "There is someone, and it's very nice, and Claude knows about it," she said. "There's no secret. We became friends first, and the romantic side happened later." She added, almost as an aside, that she thought that was rather a good way to do things. Less frantic, more like friendship. It was an extraordinarily undramatic way to describe what most marriages would treat as a small earthquake. No headlines about affairs, no lawyers, no public battle, no divorce papers filed in either direction. Just a woman in her 80s, matter-of-factly explaining that the great love story the public had followed for half a century had quietly become something else entirely, years before anyone outside the family knew to ask, and decades before she'd ever have to answer to a talk show host about it. Which leaves an uncomfortable question sitting underneath all that glamour, all that money, all those photographs of a devoted couple stepping off planes together, hand in hand, for 6 decades, cameras clicking, headlines calling them one of show business's great enduring romances. If the marriage that anchored her whole public image had been, in substance, over for 30 of those years, what exactly had all that fame and fortune actually bought her? A beautiful house in Geneva, certainly. A chalet in the mountains, a Rolls-Royce in the driveway. It had not, it turned out, bought her the one thing the fairy tale had promised from the very beginning. So she simply didn't stop. In the 1990s, well past the age most performers ease into retirement, she made her Broadway debut opposite David and Sean Cassidy in Blood Brothers, then took the production on tour across America to enthusiastic houses. Soon after, she stepped into the role of Norma Desmond in Andrew Lloyd Webber's Sunset Boulevard, a fading, silent film star clinging to a fame the world had already moved past, and played her more times than any other actress ever has, first at London's Adelphi Theatre, then across the United States. The irony of that casting is almost too neat to invent. A woman who had spent her whole life outrunning her own past image, playing, night after night, a woman who couldn't outrun hers at all. The touring never really slowed. She was still performing in Australia in her mid-80s, still releasing new material in her late 80s, a full album of French songs written specially for her by Canadian composers, and still filling venues from the Saban Theatre in Los Angeles to the B.B. King Blues Club in New York. In 2019, in her late 80s, she returned to the Prince Edward Theatre in London to play a small role in Mary Poppins, the very same stage where, 77 years earlier, a 9-year-old had once sung to calm a room full of frightened children during an air raid. 2 years later, in her 80s still, she went back again. Work, by this point, was not simply a career. It was the structure that held her days together, the answer to a question she had never quite solved any other way. She had, by her own admission, given serious thought to slowing down, more than once, and each time had come up against the same blank space on the other side of the decision. Applause is, after all, a kind of company. It does not ask what you'll do when it ends. It simply keeps coming back, night after night, for as long as you're willing to earn it, which, in her case, turned out to be nearly the whole of a very long life. In March 2024, Claude Wolfe died at 93. And despite 3 decades of separate lives, despite the friends, the private arrangements, the very public admission that the romance had ended long ago, Petula did not describe his death as a relief, or a formality, or an old chapter finally closing. She called the grief overwhelming. She said she was lost for words. A strange thing to hear from a woman who had spent 80 years finding exactly the right ones to sing. Their 3 children, Barbara, Catherine, and Patrick, had grown up scattered across the very countries their mother's career had carried the family through, and by adulthood, they didn't even sound like siblings anymore. Patrick picked up an American accent living in the States, so thoroughly that when he called home and said, "Hi, Mom," his mother would answer back in mock horror, drawing the word out, "Mahum," as though it belonged to somebody else's family entirely. Barbara, despite years abroad, still sounded faintly English. Catherine, too, carried her own version of the accent puzzle. Their mother would tease them about it on the phone, laughing at just how differently a family could turn out when its childhood took place on multiple continents at once. Homes in Geneva and Knightsbridge, and the French Alps standing in, more or less, for the single fixed address most families take for granted. It was a small, funny detail. It was also, quietly, the cost of a life spent everywhere and nowhere at the same time. In 2025, she published a memoir, Is That You, Petula? A title that reads less like a marketing hook and more like an honest question she'd apparently been asking herself for decades. In it, she reckoned openly with the gap between Petula, the name her father invented, the image the nation adored, and Sally, the ordinary Surrey girl who'd been carrying that name around since she was 10 years old. There's a photograph, somewhere, of the Prince Edward Theatre in London, the same stage where a 9-year-old once sang to calm a room of frightened children in 1942, and where, 77 years later, a woman in her 80s returned to sing again. In between those 2 performances sits an entire life, 100 million records sold, an open marriage that outlived the marriage itself, homes on 3 continents and belonging to none of them, and a woman who, by her own account, still isn't entirely sure what she'd do with a day that didn't end in applause. Money bought her nearly everything a person could want. It never quite bought her a place to finally stop moving, or a marriage that stayed what it looked like from the outside. And perhaps that's the real ending here. Not a tragedy, not a warning, just a long, glittering, exhausting search for a home that turned out to live, if anywhere, in the sound of an audience clapping back. All right, that's the story of Petula Clark. Let me know in the comments who you'd like me to cover next. I've been Chester. See you next time. Cheers.